Don, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you taking your time to do this interview.
Thank you, Lucas. This is very kind of you to do this.
We have a lot to cover, but I'm going to start in the beginning. Let's talk about your early life, growing up in Chicago and family, things like that, if you'd like to talk about that a little bit.
I'll tell you a little bit about my early life with a focus on how it may have affected my amateur radio career. We grew up in Chicago on the north side. My parents immigrated from Europe around 1900. Lost my mom when I was 12. And we lived on, I was always a Chicago Cub fan. We lived near Wrigley Field. And at the secondhand stores and places I would buy or get a hold of these old Philco and Zenith radios with shortwave bands. And I would spend quite a bit of time in my room listening to shortwave, and it was fun. And during the war, my dad was in the Army for 4 years, from the 41 until 45. Throughout World War II, we moved to Oak Park briefly. I lived in Oak Park for those years, went to grammar school, and then later moved back to the north side. I went to high school to Lane Tech on the north side, and later to a school called Chicago Latin School. I somehow was interested in becoming a doctor or a lawyer, and the school I went to about a few years after Nancy Reagan was a student there. She was known as Nancy Davis, and graduated and decided to go into medicine. During high school, I met one of my classmates, Richard, W9WNV, got me interested, and I was fascinated. He lived in a tall apartment building. He had a full 160-meter and 80-meter dipole on the roof. Got his novice, got his general, and he got me interested in ham radio. And I am fascinated by his, this was mostly CW. And eventually, I took the exam, 1953, became W9WNV, and managed to, I built what was known as an ocean hopper coil receiver for the ham bands, and a night kit transmitter. I think it was 25 watts. But we lived in an apartment building, and there was no room for an antenna. So I used what was supposed to be a 75-meter mobile whip antenna on the roof. That's all they let me put up there. A huge amount of problems with what we called Indians, TVI, television interference. And got around that and built a breadboard, some breadboard equipment. Just about shocked myself to death a couple of times in my bedroom. With that equipment, I got a thrill to work a W6 one day. Turned out to be W6VSS, who was later I would learn. I met him when he had a big station in Fallbrook, a big contest, Dale Hoppy. W6, very strong signal. And I was later privileged to help operate a team there during the DX contest. So it took me a couple months to get that valued QSL card. Later, I got one of the finest receivers that you could imagine. It was a dual conversion Hallicrafters S76. And I had a Viking, I think it was about a 100-watt transmitter that I built, still with limited antenna space. And the thrill of my life at that point in ham radio was that I was listening to a sideband conversation with somebody in New York, and I didn't know who the other station was. And I listened, and I listened, and it was W9N1MM, 9 November 1, Mickey Mouse, Father Moran, and Nepal. And oh my gosh, was I excited. I waited until he finished talking to his friend in New York, and I tail-ended on sideband, and he came back to me. So I had that QSL card. Later, we moved a few blocks away, and we were in an apartment building which was very tall, 16 stories, and we were on the 6th floor. And I got my way onto the roof to put up a tribander and a dipole way up there, overlooking Lake Michigan, and became interested in DX big time. And by this time, I had gone to take my pre-med at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And while out there, I was operating some of the time the campus radio station. And I don't remember the call sign. It was W3G something. And I can only tell you that Europe sounded a lot louder than it did from W9 land. And I eventually got a scholarship to go to the University of Illinois College of Medicine in Chicago on the west side, and almost flunked out of medical school, participating in DX contests and chasing DX. The Voice of America, whatever I could pick up on these old Philco and Zenith radios that went into the that had frequencies where you could hear these foreign stations, and it fascinated me. And I used to buy old dilapidated radios and try to use them, and I loved listening to this. In my neighborhood, we lived in this apartment building, and I've tried to describe trying to work even parts of the U.S. from a little place I had for a makeshift antenna and some homemade receiver and transmitter. I had a friend, Richard, who was a year behind me in high school. Very brilliant young man. His mom and dad were both physicians, and he lived in a tall apartment building a couple of blocks from where I lived in the apartment. We would talk at school, and he would tell me about his ham station and talking to people in different places, being able to even hear and talk to people in Europe and Australia. So invited me over to his apartment, and I saw his little station. It was all homemade. And on the roof of this 15-story or so apartment building, he had dipoles strung up. I believe there was even one for 160, but I remember an 80-meter dipole way up high, and a vertical he had up there. No beam. I would listen to him on my Ocean Hopper radio, and later with my Helicopters S-76, talking, or we were mostly CW in those days. Kind of being jealous, because that's what I would love to do. Went to his place, and he showed me everything and explained how to get a license, and showed me a book that you could learn to pass the exam. And I think that's for me. Doing pretty well in school, and passed the exam. The FCC went down and took it. 5 words a minute and some basic electronics and written test. And became a novice, W9WNV. Richard was kind of my mentor, helped me try to figure out ways to get an antenna on it, little space on the roof. Helped me put a night kit together for a 25-watt transmitter. He was very brilliant. To show you how bright he was, the game of roulette in Las Vegas, or places where they have casinos, has the wheel going around, and your odds are usually 35 to 1 before you can hit a number. He had figured out, he was a whiz at physics and math, a logarithmic way of figuring out what numbers have better odds. Well, in those days, the roulette wheels were not perfect. They were wooden, and there were little tiny differences between the vertical spikes between which the marble would fall. Normally, you'd have to have that wheel spun a few hundred times before you could detect any difference. But he had some logarithmic equation that he he came up with. And the author, he wrote to the author of a book on gambling and odds and explained this. And the author told him, oh, I rejected it. But later, he got acknowledgement from the author that this system indeed is valid. And it allowed somebody to use a particular formula where you could tell without waiting around so long for the wheel to spin hundreds of times on how to show where there's a difference, a number that you should bet on, in other words. And he had all these theories of physics and math, and he was looked at in school as this crazy kid. Turned out that he had some problems later in his life regarding crime, and it was related. Sometimes you run into a very brilliant person and he has issues. But Richard was a friend. We both went to Johns Hopkins University. His parents were both physicians for undergraduate study. Operated Johns Hopkins amateur radio station there. We lived close together at home when we weren't in school. Later, when we lived in different places and we'd operate each other's stations, stayed in touch with him until time when I was married, and he became what was regarded as a dangerous type of person, unfortunately. But in amateur radio, he was an inspiration to me to get started. If not for him, I may not have become involved at all. There were other hams in the neighborhood that I could hear because they were very close, and a number of them were friendly and helpful also. And in Chicago, there were two ham radio type stores where hams would shop for capacitors, resistors, parts, and new equipment or used equipment. One was Allied Radio and one was Newark Radio. They were both half a block or a block away from the Loop, downtown Chicago. And we would go down there and shop for a little particular value of a capacitor or a coil or some part. And Richard would build these things from scratch. Another thing he did of the mischievous nature, which eventually got him into some trouble, they had come out with devices that opened your car door, which you could also press to get an alarm or something. And he took this, he structured a broadband type of transmitter where he could, I went with him one time, it was kind of scary, into a parking lot full of cars. He pressed the button and all these sirens and horns started going off all over. It activated, apparently these automobile companies used similar frequencies, and that's the kind of mischief that he was up to. He got into trouble using a slingshot, and he was an interesting guy, and I hung out with him to an extent and helped each other with different things. And he was an inspiration for amateur radio, which I wouldn't be in it if it wasn't for Richard. My parents understood what I was doing, and as long as I didn't make too much problems with the television viewing, they were fine. And there was a gentleman who worked down at Newark Radio named Traeger, who bought and sold helicopters, receivers, transmitters, used equipment. And I saved up enough money. He gave me some deals and a lot of good advice on how to put a station together, learned to build some of my own equipment. And the DXing came along. I think I've told you the story about how I worked a W6 from that little station I had, and that was a thrill. And how a little later I happened to talk to Father Moran from Nepal, 9N1 Mickey Mouse. In operating DX and chasing new countries, I was in a lot of pile-ups, struggling through a lot of stations that were stronger and better than mine. And I learned how to cope with it, and it improved my operating skills in pile-ups, helped me perform pretty well in contests. Then I got my real DX start when I was sent to Korea. I became a DXer, chased DX, learned how to get around the pile-ups, and very often not very successfully. This was right at the tail end of when Danny Weil was doing his DXpedition from his boat in the Pacific, and Dick Spenceley was his QSL manager. And then Gus Browning was starting out around different places. But I was perturbed at times to be calling and calling and calling unsuccessfully. And day after day sometimes when I'd get home, when I got a break from school, and I would hear the same I'd hear a contact, and I thought to myself, my gosh, he talked to him yesterday, you know. We had some hams from particular parts of the country, the East Coast mostly, that had an edge on us, monopolizing some of the DXpeditioner's time. It wasn't always a DXpeditioner, it was just a ham from a foreign country. And while chasing DX, I thought to myself, you know, if I could ever go on a DXpedition someday, I might do things a little differently. I managed to win a few DX contests. And later, I had a friend, I don't know what happened to him. Maybe somebody knows that's hearing or seeing this. His name was Smokey Mann, and he was a classmate of mine in high school. He seemed to be an electronic genius. And somebody on the west side was selling a high-power amplifier, and I got it home in pieces, and he put it together for me. Well, I lived on the 6th floor, and I had these antennas up on the roof. I had a high-gain tri-bander and various dipoles and a vertical. But I managed to get permission from the janitor to use a janitor's shack that was up on the top floor, where it was just a little ladder climb up onto the roof, 16 stories high. Smokey tapped into the elevator power, which I think was 440 volts, and got 220 volts to this huge transmitter, which was taller than me. Got it together, wore these huge gloves, there was pretty high power there, and tapped into the elevator for power. And I had a high power amplifier. I don't know how many kilowatts it was, and a good receiver, and was much more successful chasing DX. But people were complaining because the elevator was jerking. Well, when I would send CW, the elevator power would go up and down, and you could almost read the CW by riding on the elevator. It would stop and go and stop and go. And we still had problems with TVs, a lot of ignition noise from the main Lake Shore Drive, which was below the apartment building. But it was fun. And eventually, I made some friends around Chicago that helped me with the antennas and so on. Experimented with antennas, designed a couple, and I learned enough to pass the general, and I believe I had an extra class at the time, but I was not really proficient in the technical part of amateur radio, as I loved operating and working DX.
What was the licensing process like during this time?
Well, to get a novice license, you had to pass a five word per minute CW test and pass a pretty simple electronic written test. And to get the general, it was 13 words a minute, which wasn't difficult for me. I'd been doing a lot of CW. It was a hand key, and later with the bugs. And in any event, throughout my internship, I would take time off to work DX and get home and back down to Cook County Hospital. When I finished my internship, at that time, family practice was not a specialty. You could go from your internship directly into practice. I took some extra pre-residency courses at a couple of hospitals on the north side, and I decided to enlist in the military, which my whole family had been involved in, and enlisted in the Air Force. So I was I went down to Gunner Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, and got some boot training there. I was a general medical officer in the Air Force, going in with the rank of captain as an enlisted man. And while I was in training, and then they decided to ship me to Korea. I thought, wow, maybe I'll get a chance to have ham radio over there. So I wrote a real nice letter to the base commander, who was at Osan Air Force Base where I was going. Some of this had to be done undercover. There was some security even then. And asked for permission to bring over some ham gear. And oh my gosh, you could see the response. You should see it. Welcome. We'll ship all the amateur radio gear we can handle. No problem, but we want you to do something for us. We want you to revitalize our Mars station. Mars, M-A-R-S, Military Amateur Radio Service, was the key way, and sometimes the only way, that our servicemen could talk back home to the U.S. And great, I shipped a ton of gear. I got another tri-bander, the biggest one at the time. I think it had about an 18-foot boom for 10, 15, and 20. I think it was 3 elements, maybe 4 on 10. And got some help disassembling it into smaller pieces, and so I could assemble it quickly and it wouldn't be quite so huge. And same with the vertical. Soldered together dipoles of every frequency imaginable, some verticals, everything. Somebody from Collins Radio helped me get some S-line, which was new. I'm jumping ahead of myself. At that point, I just had the basic equipment. I had a Viking transmitter, and I had a Collins receiver before the S-line. It was a black box with all the ham bands. So I got all this together. It must have been a ton of equipment, and shipped it to Korea and went over there. And I was at Osan Air Force Base, which is about 40 miles from Seoul, fairly close to what eventually became the demilitarized zone. When I got there, they had a large shack where they had a Mars station on the end, and the defunct equipment was still there. So I got plenty of help from the military setting up. I set up 3 phased verticals for 40 meters, the tri-bander, some dipoles, you name it. And I was HL9KH. I couldn't believe how much in demand I was. Korea was fairly rare. It wasn't in the top 10 or maybe the top 20 or 30 at the most. The Mars station, we got it rolling. There were sign-up periods where the troops could have, I think it was 10 minutes at a time, and I got the cooperation of 2 or 3 hams that had phone patches on the West Coast or close there, where we had stronger signals most of the day. And they would be overjoyed to talk to their families, especially around the holiday time. And that worked out pretty well, as did DXing. I constantly in demand, got pretty proficient at running the pile-ups, and I felt very privileged. Besides my Mars duties, I was a general medical officer, and I was frequently flying as a flight surgeon, which I really wasn't qualified for, which is when I had and some awful things happen to me. The Korean War just had ended now, and we had the demilitarized zone where there was to be no troops at all, but of course the North Korean communists were not obeying that. There was plenty of fire up there. Anytime one of our troops would be shot or there was an aircraft accident, they had to send an investigative team, and there had to be a flight surgeon on it. Our base was a very high security base. We had a U-2 there. We were short of flight surgeons, so I was assigned as a flight surgeon on these flights. And that's when my chopper was shot down. I haven't talked about this much in the ham radio sense because it doesn't have much to do with it. I lost most of my hearing when we were running from fleeing from. I managed to get one of the two pilots out of there. I was nominated for the Purple Heart. I don't think I ever received it. I even just found that out about a few years ago. Could not save the other pilot. An airman and I were running for cover, and there was some flames and some smoke, and apparently the gas tank exploded, and there was either that or a grenade went off, but I think it was the gas tank with such force that it almost knocked me off my feet, damaged both of my cochlea, which are the hearing organs, and I was totally deaf for about 10 days. I could see the choppers looking for us, but I couldn't hear them. I did eventually get a veterans recognition for disability, and they're still helping me to this day. We have a wonderful veterans military medical system, better than most people know. Anyway, that was a bad experience. We got back to the base. The colonel, Colonel Stewart, who was in charge of the hospital, he said, Dr. Miller, what were you doing up there? You're not a flight. I said, sir, you're the one that assigned me there, you know. And my hearing gradually came back little by little, but it never was the same. Unlike the other organs in your body, the cochlea don't regenerate cells, so when they're damaged, they're damaged. I am currently a candidate for cochlear transplant, which is experimental. The crash occurred in 62 or 63.
62, okay.
And I was out. I finished my tour of duty in 64. I had a chance to participate in some DXpeditions, or to organize a couple. At that time, I was often talking to an XW8, I think was the call for Laos, I'm not sure. But I met a fellow named Chuck, who was operating phone from down there. We talked often. He was with the CIA and was stationed in Vientiane, which is Vientiane, which is the capital of Laos, where they had a war going on down there that was kind of separate between the communists that were trying to take over Laos and the Laotian government. Suvarnabhumi against Phuminosavan, and the CIA was involved in that. My tour and duty in Korea, I wanted to go to Japan because I had learned to speak some Japanese, but instead I got shipped back to California to a place called Norton Air Force Base, which was near San Bernardino. It's not there anymore. We still have March Air Force Base in that area. I wasn't doing much amateur radio during that time, but following it very closely. At HL9KH, Chuck and I had talked and said, you know, when we're both through with our tour of duties ended about the same time, although he stayed on for another year or two. Let's do some DXpeditioning. When I go back to the States, I'll get some equipment ready. I'll go to a few places in the Pacific, work my way across to Southeast Asia, and we'll try to activate some of the countries over there. Nobody had Burma, nobody had Vietnam, nobody had Indonesia, nobody had Cambodia. And I don't mean nobody, but nobody had worked those places in years. Chuck was a brilliant young man, and he had connections that could get us almost anywhere. When I came back to California, I started preparing for that as my last year of service ran out. And I got some help from Collins Radio at that time and got an S-line. I got the Collins receiver, the Collins transmitter, and some real nice Collins carrying cases, which are like, not bulletproof, but very strong suitcases, padded to accommodate each of those. We had not just beginning to come to the era of where split frequency operating was the standard.
What was your rank when you left the military?
Lucas, I went in as a captain. I felt a little bit guilty because it's really the sergeants that run the military. I felt that I should be saluting them first. and they were everything. Helped me with everything from the hospital I worked in to the setting up the station. They actually had a cherry picker on the base that was able to get to the top of a 40 or 45-foot tower that happened to be nearby, and helped me anytime I needed it. That was my rank because of the my medical assignment. Now, I mentioned that I was assigned as a flight surgeon, and that happened pretty frequently because whenever one of our airmen was shot or one of our planes was down, they'd have to send an investigative team, and there had to be a flight surgeon on the team. And I wasn't a flight surgeon, but I learned how to fill out the forms and check wreckage and do things which weren't part of what I was trained for. It was on one of those missions that our helicopter was hit, and I didn't even notice it at the time. There were times when we shaked a little bit, and apparently one of them was a hit. And then when I looked out the keyhole on the left, I could see the trees going by, and I braced myself because I knew we were going to crash. As I may have mentioned this, we got the pilot out of there, but we couldn't get the co-pilot out. When we were running for cover is when the gas tank exploded, ruined my cochlea. It was so loud. And to this day, I have trouble differentiating. They call it speech recognition. Hearing aids won't help that because they only amplify the sound. Also, I should mention that I was when I was in Korea, I had other duties. I was assigned as, excuse me, but it's true, the VD officer. We had a terrible problem with venereal disease because every place there was a military base, the Korean ladies would accumulate because it was such a poor country, very little chance for them to get an education and get a job, and they would look for the troops to do something with. And I was also the pharmacy officer, so we had huge quantities of antibiotics to treat that kind of thing, and we had a constant problem with theft. The Koreans, again, they were very poor, and we constantly had theft from our barracks and the hospital, and I had to keep track of all of that and have training sessions for the troops for the airmen on how to conduct themselves and what precautions to take. The Catholic chaplain on the base was very upset with us for passing out condom kits to the troops who were leaving the base for the evening. And there was a lot of controversy about that. It was not an easy job, but we managed to get things under some control. And I had a lot of those kind of duties. Well, a couple of things happened to me that I'd like to mention that are worthy of mention. One of the greatest experiences is that we had a lot of orphanages for poor Korean children. We were about 40 miles south of Seoul, and the sergeants did most of the work. They would get some lumber, build shacks, and we didn't throw anything out in Korea, not even a can of Coke, which could be used for a pipe from a wood stove exhaust to heat a shack. It was very cold there in the winter. We went to visit the orphanages and got to hug the children and had them greet us and meet the teacher. Well, I'll never forget. One Christmas, I dressed up like Santa Claus, and we got a whole bunch of toys, and I had a big bag of toys, and we went to visit this one orphanage that we had built. Again, the sergeants organized all of this, and it was fun, and it was very rewarding, very nice thing that I enjoyed doing. I'll never forget this incident. I'm almost crying now to think about it. We visited this orphanage on a cold winter night, with toys, and the teacher had taught these Korean children how to sing Silent Night in English. And they sang Silent Night for us. And tears were coming down my eyes. This was beyond description. And it was just wonderful. And I got a lot of personal satisfaction out of doing a few good things over there, even though the experience of being shot down was not pleasant. Ham radio was part of the whole picture, and we were able to set up the Mars station. And while there, I got a chance to plan and participate some DXpeditions in Southeast Asia and on the islands. One of them I'll tell you about first. The Marianas Islands, a U.S. territory, had split up into two different so-called countries, according to DXCC, two separate DXCC entities. The Northern Marianas were one, separate from Guam, and it was a new country. Nobody had been there. The Air Force flew me down to Taipei and then to Agana, Guam, I think it was Agana Air Force Base, with all my equipment. And we went to, we got a boat over to Rhode Island, which was near Saipan in the new country of the Marianas Islands. We tried to keep it secret. Planning this trip, I happened to be in touch with the ARRL's chief of DX operations, Bob White, bless his heart, W9WNV. He did a lot for DX. He was very, by today's standards, very lax, and they had some rules, few of which were followed consistently. DX was kind of a fun game then, and almost anything went. I said, Bob, what call sign am I going to use? I frequently talked to Bob White about the call signs, and he knew what we were doing, and I kept him, he was easy to contact.